Friends is one of those shows that feels like it built an entire world. Not just six people in apartments, an actual universe with exes, bosses, siblings, weddings, babies, and rivals, which makes one thing feel even weirder when you notice it. Certain characters don't just leave, they vanish. No goodbye, no closure, sometimes not even a casual mention, and the reason it happens isn't always what fans assume. Some disappearances were story decisions. Some were audience-driven, some were production reality. And a few, they're the kind of quiet erasure that only happens when a show is determined to keep its spotlight locked on the core cast.
And if you've ever had that moment where you're rewatching and thinking, wait, what happened to them? You're not imagining it. Let's go through the real, confirmed reasons where we have them, and the clearest explanation where we don't, because once you see the pattern, you'll start noticing it everywhere. Start with the disappearance that confuses people the most, because it's not a random side character, it's Ross's son. Ben Geller should be impossible to lose. He's not a coworker. He's not a date of the week. He's literally Ross's kid. Proof Ross had a whole life before Central Perk became his permanent address. And early on, the show treats Ben like he matters. Ross becomes a dad in the very first season's orbit. Ben is part of big moments. And the co-parenting dynamic with Carol and Susan is a real storyline engine. So when Ben stops appearing, it doesn't feel like a normal TV fade-out. It feels like the show broke its own reality. Here's the part that's 100% verifiable. Ben's final on-screen appearance is Season 8, Episode 12, the one where Joey dates Rachel. After that, he's later mentioned, but he doesn't show up again. And that's why fans keep asking the same question. How do you introduce Emma, make Ross a dad again, and never have Ben even share the screen with his half-sister? That's not just a missing cameo. That's a missing chunk of the family tree. Now, what's the real reason in the strictest sense? There isn't one neat, universally agreed, on-record quote that says, "Here is the single explanation." So the only responsible way to frame it is this. The show's writing priorities shifted hard toward endgame arcs centered on the core six, and Ben was a recurring character the writers simply stopped spending screen time on. And when Cole Sprouse got asked about it years later, he gave a joking, in-character answer, basically blaming Ross's parenting presence. But that's clearly humor and commentary, not a production memo. So if you want the most accurate takeaway, it's not Ben was fired, or a scandal happened, or any of the dramatic stuff people toss around online. It's colder than that. It's that in a sitcom built like Friends, time is precious, and anything that doesn't feed the main six eventually gets squeezed out. And Ben is the clearest example of how ruthless that squeeze can be. But Ben isn't the only disappearance that fans still debate. There's one character who didn't just fade, she was positioned like a life-changing twist. And then, the show slammed the door. Emily. Emily is one of the biggest, this could have changed everything moments in Friends history. She marries Ross. She's tied to one of the most iconic cliffhangers the show ever pulled. And yet, in the grand story of Friends, she becomes almost radioactive. She's not just written out, she becomes someone the show avoids, like saying her name too many times might summon her back. What makes Emily's exit different is that we actually have reputable reporting tied to a major behind-the-scenes voice. Director James Burrows, who directed many episodes and later discussed the show through memoir coverage, said the Ross/Emily dynamic didn't work the way it needed to. The reporting around Burrows' comments is blunt. He didn't feel the pairing had the comedic chemistry, and there were even discussions about recasting, but production timing made that unrealistic. And additional coverage notes that Helen Baxendale was pregnant around that time, which outlets describe as coincidental timing alongside story direction. So the accurate, real reason here isn't a single switch being flipped. It's multiple forces stacking. The story already had Ross tethered to Rachel emotionally. The famous wedding mistake made Emily's marriage basically impossible to play as a long, cozy sitcom situation. And behind the scenes, key creatives didn't feel the pairing had the spark that made the show hum. That combination is deadly for a character. Because Friends doesn't just need romance, it needs romance that produces comedy, conflict, and momentum, without blocking the show's main engine. Emily did the opposite. She was a wall, a believable wall. Sure, but still a wall. And Friends is not a show that likes walls between its core, will they won't they characters for too long. And if you think that's harsh, wait until you hear about the character who was actually nice. Like, genuinely nice. The kind of person you'd want in real life. And the audience basically decided she had to go. Julie. Julie is a wild case because she's not written as a villain. She's not a cartoon. She's competent, calm, and pretty reasonable. Which is exactly why she never had a chance. Because her real job isn't to be a person. It's to be an obstacle. She exists in a moment when Friends needed to stretch the Ross/Rachel tension without paying it off too early. And when you do that, whoever stands between the couple becomes a target, even if they did nothing wrong. And here's the part that's confirmed through reporting. Actress Lauren Tom talked about how live audiences reacted to Julie, people booing her during tapings because fans were intensely invested in Ross and Rachel. That's not a vague rumor, that's a performer describing the vibe in the room, and it tells you something important about Friends. This show wasn't just watched, it was emotionally policed. Julie didn't disappear because she was a weak character. Julie disappeared because her presence threatened the outcome the audience wanted. The show could have tried to keep her around longer, but it didn't need to. Her job was done the second Rachel and Ross were ready to cross the line. And the faster she left, the faster the show could get back to the fantasy the audience was paying for. The idea that Ross and Rachel are inevitable, even when they're being completely chaotic about it. Now, Julie's exit feels like normal sitcom mechanics. But Friends also has a different kind of disappearance. The kind where the character was once central to the story's emotional realism. And then the show slowly decided it didn't want that realism anymore. Carol and Susan. In the early seasons, Carol and Susan aren't side-flavored. They're a serious part of Ross's life. Carol is Ross's ex-wife. Susan is her partner. Ben's birth is a major emotional plot line. Their dynamic is also historically notable for network TV representation in the 90s, and Friends actually built episodes around them, including major life events. And then, over time, you see the shift. Less screen time, fewer moments, fewer reasons for them to be there. By later seasons, they're basically gone from the show's day-to-day world, even though, realistically, they'd still be part of Ross's life through co-parenting. Here's the safest, most accurate way to explain why. Friends increasingly narrowed its focus. As the show went on, it became more centered on the core six's romantic endgames, careers, and living situations. And characters like Carol and Susan are tied to a specific Ross arc, the early life consequences Ross had before the group fully formed. When the show's tone shifted toward keeping the friend group's bubble intact, characters who pulled the story outward into real adult logistics naturally showed up less. Could there be more behind it? Maybe. Fans speculate about everything from scheduling to story preference. But unless we have a solid, reputable, on-record statement, the truth is simpler. Recurring characters exist when the writers need them. And once the show no longer needs that particular storyline engine, recurring characters become optional. Carol and Susan became optional. But Friends wasn't just phasing out characters, it was also swapping them out. And one of the most easily missed behind-the-scenes changes is a recast that happened so early, many viewers don't even realize it happened. Carol was recast. If you go back to the earliest episodes, Ross's ex-wife Carol is originally played by Anita Barone. Then later, the role is played by Jane Sibbett, the Carol most people remember. And the reported reason for that recast is straightforward. Anita Barone left for a more prominent role elsewhere. This is the kind of thing that reminds you how fragile TV reality is. A character can feel like a fixed part of the universe, and behind the scenes it's still just casting decisions, contracts, and availability. Friends was lucky the recast didn't break the illusion too much. But it's still a great example of how the show's world was constantly being adjusted to keep the main machine running. Now, some characters didn't disappear because they were obstacles, and they didn't disappear because the show narrowed focus. They disappeared because their story ended in a way that felt almost like the writers hit the eject button. Pete Becker. Pete is one of the strangest arcs Friends ever did because it starts grounded. He's rich, sure, but he's believable. He dates Monica. There's real chemistry. It feels like one of those relationships that could last a while, at least as a recurring presence. And then, his storyline swerves into something that feels like a totally different show. Pete decides he needs to become the ultimate fighting champion, and the relationship dies because Monica can't watch him destroy himself, while Pete refuses to stop. That's the confirmed on-screen reason. And it's important to keep it there, because the internet loves to explain Pete's exit with behind-the-scenes claims that are messy and inconsistent across sources. Without strong primary confirmation, it's not responsible to present those as fact. But even sticking to what we know, Pete's disappearance reveals a pattern Friends used a lot. Sometimes a romance is not meant to be a romance. It's meant to be a turning point. Pete is Monica's almost. He's the relationship that proves she can attract someone serious, someone stable, someone high status, and still feel like it's not right. His exit doesn't need to be tidy, because the point isn't Pete's future. The point is Monica's trajectory back toward the story the show actually wants to tell. And once you accept that, the next disappearance makes even more sense, because it's one of the most emotional relationships Chandler ever had before his real endgame. And it got shut down fast. Kathy. Kathy is one of the few relationships on Friends that feels like it shifts Chandler into a more adult emotional space. It's not just jokes, it's longing, it's a risk, it's guilt because Joey is involved. It forces Chandler to actually act like a person with consequences. And then the storyline collapses into betrayal, and Kathy is gone. Now, the accurate way to discuss this is careful. We can say what happens on screen, and we can also point to the fact that Paget Brewster has spoken publicly about her experience around the role and how things played out. But we shouldn't jump from that to the writers hated her or they fired her, because that leaps beyond what's cleanly confirmable. What Kathy's disappearance really shows is how Friends uses side characters as emotional tools. Kathy is the relationship that teaches Chandler he can want something deeply and still sabotage it. She's the storyline that helps him become the version of himself who can later commit fully, communicate better, and stop hiding behind jokes as a shield. Once that job is done, Kathy doesn't get to stay, because the show isn't building a new core couple with her. It's building Chandler. And if that sounds cold, it kind of is. Because that's the hidden rule of Friends. Side characters don't have their own gravity. They borrow gravity from the main six. When the main six no longer need them, the show stops spending time on them. Sometimes that looks like a clean breakup. Sometimes it looks like a dramatic exit. And sometimes it looks like a quiet vanishing act that leaves fans asking questions for decades. So what's the real reason some characters disappeared from Friends? It's not one reason. It's a system. Some characters were pushed out because they stood between the audience and the couple the audience was desperate to see. Julie is the perfect example, and we know from Lauren Tom's experience that the crowd response could be brutal. Some characters were written out because the show's creative leadership felt the dynamic wasn't working at the level Friends needed. Emily's arc is the clearest example, supported by reputable reporting tied to James Burrows' statements. Some characters faded because the show narrowed into an endgame tunnel where anything outside the core six became optional. Ben's confirmed last appearance makes that sting feel even sharper, because it exposes the gap between real-life logic and sitcom focus. And some changes were simply the reality of TV production, like recasting a role because an actor moved on. And if you want the most surprising takeaway, it's this. Friends didn't forget characters by accident. The show protected a very specific fantasy, the fantasy that no matter what happens, the core six stay the center of the universe, babies can be born, weddings can collapse, relationships can explode, but the spotlight always snaps back to the couch at Central Perk, the apartment doors, and that friend group bubble. That's why disappearances feel so strange. Because the moment a character stops serving that bubble, it's like the show's universe quietly deletes them to keep the illusion intact. And once you notice that, you'll start spotting mini disappearances everywhere. Characters who feel huge for a few episodes, then become a punchline, then become a memory, then become nothing at all.